Hello everyone, this is a video on the themes of fairness, justice and mercy, as well as some on Prejudice 2 in Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice. This is specifically made for AQA English at GCSE level. However, if you're watching this for another course syllabus or curriculum in the UK or more internationally, then this will be somewhat helpful to you too. That's the aim anyway. So let's just offer a little bit of a summary on what happens as it relates to the ideas about justice in the play. So we can say that Shakespeare makes us think about the importance of fairness, justice, and mercy, both as an original audience who would have been watching it in 1596 or 97, and to us moderns living in 2020 who are trying to get to grips with it. We obviously have fairly different ideas about what these big words, these big concepts of fairness, justice, and mercy are. We have different ideas. However, we can establish what original audiences might have thought about a character like Shylock and what we think about the character of Shylock. So, just to summarize now, Antonio claims to not like the practice of taking profit on loans as Shylock does. That's Shylock's practice. However, I think this is true. Antonio never says explicitly that profit taking on loans is against the Christian law of Renaissance Venice. However, when Shylock agrees to lend him the 3,000 ducats, he asks for a pound of flesh, as we know, as his insurance. Today, we might think that this eccentric behavior is unjust as it places a financial value on human life. As we know, when it seems that Antonio's ships will not be returning home, he is unable to repay this loan to Shylock. So by the strict letter of the law demanded in Venice, he must stick to the contract he offers, and therefore Antonio accepts that justice must be done, even if he must die as a result. However, as we know, when Bassanio offers to pay double the original loan, 6,000 ducats in the court, Shylock still insists persistently, he insists on the pound of flesh, and Shylock thinks that if he is merciful, perhaps people will think him foolish and weak. He is confident that justice is on his side. And Shylock's rigid idea of justice is further motivated, we could say, by Jessica's betrayal, his daughter's disappearance, and the continuous anti-Semitic prejudice he faces as a Jewish man in this Italian city-state. Since Shylock is usually shown no mercy by the Venetian public, he offers none. So that's an interesting take there. And that's perhaps one of the reasons that Shylock does act with the kind of apparent cruelty that the citizens of Venice think he does. Right. So Portia, disguised as a law clerk Balthazar, reveals herself to be nimble with legal reasoning in the courtroom, invalidating Shylock's claim to the pound of flesh. If a drop of blood should fall as a result of Shylock extracting the pound of flesh, he will be guilty of murder. To modern and to some extent original audiences, we are invited to think about whether it is always right and fair to stick to a contract, for example. This is just one issue to do with justice. Or in certain situations, mercy and flexibility are more just. Okay, with that in mind about justice, I'd just like to walk you through an exam-style question about prejudice, which is somewhat related to the ideas of fairness, justice, and mercy. However, they are different concepts, of course. So this is a question adapted from the AQA syllabus. Let's just dive into it. So starting with these lines from Act 2, Scene 8, how does Shakespeare present prejudice? So we're given a scene here in which Salanio and Salarino, in fact, are talking. So, and we'll see what they're talking about in a second. So, forgive me for these lines. I'm just reading out the lines of the play. So Salanio says, the villain Jew with outcries raised the Duke, who went with him to search Bassanio's ship. He came out too late. The ship was under sail, but there the Duke was given to understand that in a gondola were seen together Lorenzo and his amorous Jessica. Besides, Antonio certified the Duke they were with Bassanio in his ship. I never heard a passion so confused, so strange, outrageous, and so variable as the dog Jew did utter in the streets. My daughter, oh my ducats, oh my daughter, Fled with a Christian, oh my Christian ducats, justice, the law, my ducats and my daughter, a silk bag, 2 silk bags of ducats, of double ducats stolen from me by my daughter, and jewels, 2 stones, 2 rich and precious stones, stolen by my daughter, justice, find the girl. She hath the stones upon her and the ducats. Why, all the boys in Venice follow him, crying his stones, his daughter, and his ducats. Let good Antonio look, keep his day, or he shall pay for this. Sorry. So clearly, I shouldn't be an actor, but this is a scene of about a few lines, a few dozen lines, from Act 2, Scene 8. So the 2 sub-questions we're given is, how does Shakespeare present attitudes towards Shylock in the extract, and how Shakespeare presents attitudes towards Shylock in the play as a whole, considering the question of prejudice. So obviously we have an exchange between 2 fairly prejudiced characters who are not sympathetic to Shylock's situation at all. So how would we go about answering this? Well, obviously, as we know, we have about 45 minutes in the exam to do this justice. So obviously, in the introduction, we need an overview of the answer to the question. So we might use the sentence stems. Shakespeare presents, or Shakespeare shows us that prejudice was a substantial issue with multiple ethnic groups, like Moors and Jews. This is adapted from a student, taken from a student example that I tutor. I think there are things that are good as well as not so good with it. However, I think first of all, we might go about offering a definition. So we might say prejudice can be defined as any preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. So we all are prejudiced to some extent, even about maybe more casual things about, say, whether a certain food is good or bad. However, in this context, in this situation, it is usually negative, and historically it has resulted in harm or injury that results or may result from some action or judgment, both at the small or large scale. So that's a bit kind of abstract and vague, but prejudice is usually negative, and historically it has meant that violence has been inflicted on certain groups or groups of people, both at the level of kind of more casual interactions, but also things like wars at the larger scale between kingdoms, between kind of different kinds of social structures that exist. So kingdoms, fiefdoms, nations, modern nation states, tribes, etc., etc. Okay, so this student has written, in the 16th century, prejudice was a substantial issue with multiple ethnic groups like Moors and Jews stereotypes against Jews for not being Christian. That's not untrue. That's not bad. In The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare, Shakespeare presents his varying viewpoints of prejudice through the use of multiple characters like Shylock and the Prince of Morocco. He appears to question prejudice, but possibly agrees with it too. So this student, I would recommend to them not using, repeating the word Shakespeare in quick succession like this, but using the pronoun he. That's just one thing. And while this isn't untrue, that Moors and Jews were stereotyped against due to being Christian, they were obviously stereotyped differently with regards to their non-Christianness. It's a bit general and a bit ahistorical. Prejudice has always been a substantial issue of this century, the 21st, but also the 20th. It's only because people have made gains in coming together, social gains, for defending one another's right to be different, that prejudice has taken a bit of a back seat. But obviously there are many parts of the world where that's obviously not the case. So just as a bit of background, a major reason for why Jews were kind of the subject of ridicule and violence, as Shylock is here, when we are told that all the boys in Venice follow him, crying his stones, his daughter, and his ducats. So clearly he's in grief and lamentation, but he's nevertheless being kind of ridiculed by the boys in Venice. So Jews have been the subjects of kind of marginalization and violence in Europe since, well, arguably since antiquity, when they were persecuted a lot by the Romans, but more recently to this play in the 14th century in medieval Europe, um, there were pogroms, kind of mob violence against Jews, for apparently being responsible for the Black Death, for the kind of infectious disease that took a lot of lives, because apparently in some way they were not as highly infected as the Christian population. And this had to do, in modern terms, with the fact that they were in ghettos and largely isolated, um, and were not so vulnerable to the risk of infection. At least that's one interpretation there. Anyway, so we could say that. So that's just a bit of background for for writing a statement like this. We could say that we could add to this that prejudice has always been a substantial issue in the 1590s of Shakespeare's time, as we'll suggest. You could say something like, there was a substantial hatred of money lending for profit, and it's worth saying that the term Jew as a term of abuse had been a catch-all term of abuse since the 13th century for money lenders who were lending for profit, even if they weren't lending for, even if they weren't Jewish. Sorry. So this is documented by Harold Bloom in the 2006 Yale edition, if you can find that. And you can read the introduction there. There's an essay there, which is quite good. However, we can also say, we can edit this introduction a bit and say, in representing the prejudice that existed against Moor and Jews, we do not know exactly if Shakespeare was simply susceptible to the stereotypes of his time. We don't know much about the character of Shakespeare as a person, the moral character of Shakespeare, or if he's interested in allowing such peoples to be humanized, by bearing witness to the prejudice that is done against them, right? So whether or not this has the effect of destroying the stereotypes, the prejudice against a Moor or a Jew, lies with the mindset of the original or contemporary audience. So there's a bit of a kind of a thinking pattern that goes on amongst students, which basically says that because Shakespeare is presenting the prejudice against Shylock, he's on Shylock's side, really, fundamentally. I'd be cautious about this. We don't want to fall into an intentional kind of fallacy. Our perception of Shylock lies as much with us as it does with the play. I would suggest, however, that there are two key speeches, both in Act 1, Scene 3 and Act 3, Scene 1, in which Shylock is given these speeches, one in iambic pentameter and one in regular prose, in which his humanity really, really comes forth. So that's the one where he's one in Act 1, Scene 3, where he's talking. You call me a misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and he's speaking to Antonio. And the other one is the famous, hath the Jew not eyes, senses, affections, dimensions. And these really allow Shylock's common humanity to really shine forth to our modern sense that everyone should be treated equally. And that is a new idea, actually, that people should be treated with kind of basic decency and respect, if that's what we mean when we say people should be treated equally. So when it comes to the character of the Prince of Morocco, also, we can suggest that in allowing a Moorish character to speak about prejudice, though not exactly as a high-born Moor would speak, Shakespeare is interested in subverting common prejudices about dark complexion. So we'll come back to that in a paragraph below, in the main body of the essay. And that's an interesting one as well, because that's another sometimes neglected part of the play, about Portia's prejudice as well. So that's briefly about ways of thinking about the introduction there. So we only need really one paragraph, and that should take no longer than 5 to 10 minutes. The remaining sections of the essay, I would suggest that after your introduction, where you've given an overview of the question and the characters that you're going to talk about, you go on to offer a word on context. So we might say, we might move this paragraph here, this comment on context, on Shakespeare's 1590s above the main PEE paragraphs and offer it just after the introduction. So I've just offered this, and you may find this helpful. I think it's helpful. It is definitely relevant to the play that around 20 years before The Merchant of Venice was first performed on the London stage, scholars believe, 1596, 1597, there was also a play with a, quote, villainous Jewish usurer, so someone that lends for profit, on stage, according to John Gross, who wrote the book Sherlock, A Legend and Its Legacy, which I recommend you go and look at if you're interested. This character was not given as many opportunities, crucially, to speak about his deep pain at the prejudice he faces as Shylock does, as I've already mentioned in 1.3 and 3.1. Right. Okay. In this sense, because Shylock is given these two opportunities, Shylock is able to draw from the anti-Semitic culture of Venice, but he's also able to offer Shylock as a Jew a rare opportunity to really speak in this kind of more in this appeal to kind of to humanity in a force which kind of is kind of interested in destroying prejudice. However, so Shakespeare is able to draw from an anti-Semitic culture, one where Jew had been a catch-all term of abuse, as I've said, for money lenders since the 13th century, and he's able to offer witness and voice to common human pain, rarely offered to such a minority group on the stage of his time. We've offered an introduction, we've offered a paragraph on context, we now need to write maybe at least 3 or 4 paragraphs offering a close reading of this scene, and included in those 3 or 4 paragraphs how Shakespeare presents Shylock in the rest of the play, with relation to the question of prejudice. So we need to have key phrases, key quotes, select textual details to make sure that our quotes are only as long as the point we're making. And ideally, because I see this a lot from students, is that when we're doing the explanation sentence of the PEE paragraph, we avoid the phrase, this shows that, or this gives us evidence for. While this may be true, we could try to move a bit beyond the language of showing and telling, and this just makes our analysis sound a little bit more convincing, although we should always remember to remain clear. So we're offering a comment on the language, the imagery, the rhythm, the rhyme scheme, if it's applicable, which it is here, but I haven't commented on it, and the subject matter, which is the key thing, the subject matter, the theme of Prejudice. What does it tell us about how a certain character is received, is thought of? So in this case, it's Shylock, how he's thought of in Venetian culture, society, in fact, sorry. So I've just offered a paragraph. You should ideally write 2 at least. This is just an example. I'm not sure how good it is. So if you're thinking about using it, I would just caution you not to, because I'm not an expert actually, but this hopefully will give you a way to think about how to do a close reading. So I've said, in this scene, Salanio and Salarino reveal their unambiguous prejudices to the villain and dog Jew as they describe Shylock. These adjectives, word class, what kind of word is it, reveal their unsympathetic and deeply entrenched attitudes. However, more importantly, in this scene, the passionate outcry of Shylock on learning of Jessica's unfilial behavior, so violating the customary obligations of a daughter, is reported secondhand by the gallants Salarino and Salanio, in fact. So gallants are men who are flirtatious to women, and not represented directly. So this kind of mimicking of Shylock is why should we trust it? Why should we believe that Salanio's imitation that Shylock was more grieved at the loss of his ducats than that of his daughter should should have married a hated Christian? And would a direct representation of Shylock in despair have drawn too deep a draft on our sympathies for him? So, in other words, what is Shakespeare doing in having these two men imitate Shylock and his grief? Structurally, this seems to be a confirmation of anti-Semitic culture in which Shylock is just as interested, if not more so, in money than his daughter. So we could probe this a little bit more. Does this mean that we should um, think that Shakespeare is not interested in uh, defeating prejudice, or should we just say, we don't know? So modern audiences would do well to distrust this exchange. That's all we can really say. So we know that these men are prejudiced. So therefore, we should just say that this is what they think about Shylock. They think he's just as interested, apparently, according to the reports that have been going around, that he's been in grief and lamentation about his ducats and his daughter as well. Okay, so having offered a comment on that scene that we've been given, we should go on to comment on the attitudes to Shylock in the rest of the play with relation to prejudice. So we know that near the beginning of the play, this is from a student example again, and I've modified it. We should also signal. I'll say what's good about this and what's wrong about it, or what not so good about it, not wrong about it. We should say that we should maybe say in the rest of the play, Shakespeare appears to suggest that prejudice is wrong by highlighting Shylock's treatment, why Antonio dislikes him. Originally, the student had written a slash, Shylock's treatment slash why Antonio dislikes him. I've just put that in brackets. Anyway, they've said, this is supported by, you call me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and spit upon my Jewish gabardine. I would say offer the scene number, the act and scene number. According to Shylock's list of complaints, it is evidence that Antonio dislikes him, or at least resents him for his, quote, usances. That's Shylock's phrase. And this is all how Shylock believes people perceive him, where previously it was how other people perceive Shylock. So in the scene that we've just looked at. So Shylock believes that it is the use of interest that on his loans is the reason why Antonio dislikes him. Antonio does not disagree at any point. It's worth saying that Antonio dislikes him for the use of interest on his loan. Though we never hear Antonio call Shylock a misbeliever, according to Shylock, this word suggests that he believes that the source of his prejudice comes from the fact that he believes in the wrong religion, so he's not a Roman Catholic Christian. And this student has also said, here Shakespeare evidently questions whether prejudice against people is justified just because they do not believe in the same religion. So I've said to this student I would take this out, not because it's wrong as such, but again, we can't really suggest that this point isn't for suggesting that Shakespeare questions whether prejudice against people is justified. This point above is not so strong for kind of making that point, I don't think. I think we could be a bit more kind of cautious, a bit more tentative, and just basically say, in this exchange at least, while it technically may not be the case that Shakespeare questions whether prejudice is justified against people, he manages to establish, at the very least, that the everyday prejudices that Jews in Renaissance Venice must endure through the mouth of those, through the mouth of someone who suffers its casual injustices. Okay, be careful about your pronouns as I've just make sure your sentences make sense as well. Okay, so the audience will likely be in a better position though to respond compassionately later in 3-1. This is what arguably this speech is doing here in 1-3, when Shylock makes his piercing speech about his common humanity to Celerino and Salanio. So after they've made their comments, their imitation in Act 2, Scene 8. So Act 3, Scene 1, Shylock will make the speech about hath the Jew eyes, hath the Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? I think that's a key key aspect of common humanity. All of the good aspects, all of the good and the positive and the negative aspects of humanity are replicated at large throughout humanity. So compassion, but also revenge as well. So that's worth keeping in mind. And that's just one paragraph there. And what we've done is we've sort of connected it in a sequence, establishing the prejudice that Shylock faces throughout the play. So what we've really done is we've really condensed and telescoped all of the prejudice that Shylock faces throughout the play into maybe a few paragraphs. I wouldn't say this is perfect, but I think it does offer a lot of the things that you would do well to do, using key phrases, telescoping the key themes throughout the play into one or two paragraphs. However, you might want to add more about the Prince of Morocco. So we might say, furthermore, we might say it is not only Jews who provide teachable moments to their audience about prejudice in this play. So again, linking the terms of the question, connecting to previous paragraphs. We can suggest that in allowing a Moorish character, the Prince of Morocco, to speak about prejudice, though not exactly as a highborn Moor would speak, because they'd probably be speaking in Arabic or some kind of a Berber language, maybe. I'm not entirely sure about that. Forgive me. Shakespeare might be interested in subverting common prejudices about dark complexions. So he says he's described as tawny or a light-skinned Moor. He enters with great dignity, but fears the prejudice of the Venetian. And so he asks, the first thing he says is that he asks them not to dislike him for his complexion. Likewise, in the 1590s, this is a start comment on context now, which you can keep or not keep, but it's just one sentence, and it's good to remember. Queen Elizabeth's court enjoyed a good relationship with the royal families of North Africa, but they were probably treated with some suspicion by the population at large. And you can go and look at a portrait of a Moorish ambassador to Queen Elizabeth, in fact, on the British Library website. Someone that was believed to be an inspiration for everything Shakespeare wrote with relation to Moorish characters, both in The Merchant of Venice and Othello a few years later. But to get back to the Prince of Morocco, and a kind of analysis of the language, which we're doing here, he says, despite his good manners and high status, when the prince fails the casket test, Portia expresses her relief in terms of his skin color. Let all of his complexion choose me so. So let all of his complexion choose wrongly, choose the golden casket as he did, Prince of Morocco did, revealing her prejudice against the prince and the people who look like him. So subtly, Portia is expressing relief that the Prince of Morocco wasn't able to win the casket challenge, and therefore not win her and control Belmont. And this is just another comment which you can either keep or not keep in your essays. I would say don't keep it, because it doesn't answer it's not speaking directly to the Merchant of Venice, which you're supposed to do, but it should not be forgotten. Only a few years after the Merchant of Venice, the playwright Shakespeare will attempt a complex portrayal of Othello, an honourable military commander and more, who encounters deep prejudice again in Venice, an outsider in Venice, but is highly valued for his military expertise when it serves Venetian interests. So you could say, perhaps, yes, actually, Shakespeare is not like the common man. He actually is interested in destroying prejudices. Having offered an introduction, a main body, and a comment on context, we now need to offer a conclusion, tying up decisively, summarizing what we said in the main body, connecting it, but also saying something a bit new, explaining what we think ultimately overall the main message Shakespeare wants to convey to the audience through his presentation of Shylock and the prejudice he faces is. Your conclusion should join the thread of your main body, so it should discuss the key scenes that you discuss. So if you've discussed Act 2, Scene 8, the scene that we've been given, and some of the other ones like Act 1, Scene 3 and Act 3, Scene 1, you should rediscuss those again in your summary, your conclusion. So there should be a thread of continuity going throughout your essay. Something my conclusion could do a bit better of, because we haven't really discussed Sherlock's demand for justice in this essay, but it is the underlying thing, which moves the action forward. Um, I've tried to use the terms of the question again, so I've said that Shakespeare shows us that prejudice complicates Sherlock's demand for justice, and that's very, I think, uncontroversial. It's true. One suggestion is a convincing sentence, I think. One suggestion is that Sherlock is unwilling to grant mercy in the courtroom to Antonio, since he rarely receives any. As he says earlier to Solani and Salarino, the villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. In one sense, his revenge is a product of the city-state in which he lives. So, in the one sense, we've seen Salarino and Solano exhibit a certain amount of prejudice to him, both when he's there and he's not there. But, in one sense, Sherlock dispenses it back at them as well, through his stubbornness. In one sense, Shakespeare shows us that both Sherlock's demand for justice to the word of his bond, ignoring the promise of double it of his original bond, is his undoing. It's his kind of fatal flaw. And that's in a society that is quick to punish Jewish peoples and denies them their fundamental humanity, denies them the right to own property, as well as many other freedoms as well. So they must be in the ghetto after dark. They must wear a red hat, as you'll see if you watch some adaptations. On the other hand, original audiences may have understood prejudicially that his extreme inflexibility in this regard, to kind of just say, yeah, I'll take the 6,000 ducats, is a product of the cruelty of Jews more generally, something we don't really subscribe to now. But contemporary audiences will be more sympathetic. They hopefully should be more sympathetic. They will understand that the betrayal of his daughter and the disappearance of his monies in a society that denies him many of the same basic liberties as Christians are a part of Shylock's stubborn, vengeful motivation for the original word of his bond. So, yes, in one sense, there is prejudice on both sides. However, there is an asymmetry of prejudice, and ultimately, the minority loses, unfortunately. So you can really add to this, and this is basically what this conclusion says, although I haven't really expanded it as much as I should do, because I'm trying to give it to you in a more kind of accessible way for GCSE. So hopefully this has been a helpful video. If it hasn't, tell me what I should do better. Speak slower. Don't use as many big words. I'd be grateful for your feedback.